The air in the old New York theater was thick with the scent of dust, varnish, and the faint tang of old wood. Built in 1892, the theater had survived decades of change, roaring 20s performances, silent films, and the golden age of Broadway. Its walls carried the echoes of 100 premieres, the whispers of actors long gone, and the subtle creak of stage boards that had witnessed countless dramas. It was here, in these shadowed corridors and vaulted backstage rooms, that the first act of a deadly drama was about to unfold. Benjamin Hart stepped through the grand archway of the theater, his coat brushing against the polished banisters. The police chief had met him outside, frustration etched across his face. Another one, hard. Third in 2 weeks. All on stage, all precise, all impossible. He gestured toward the velvet curtained stage. We have no idea how they do it. Benjamin's eyes swept across the theater, the gilded balconies, the ornate chandeliers, the maze of catwalks above the stage where rigging and ropes intertwined like a spider's web. Every inch of this historical theater was a potential clue, every shadow a possibility. He felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle unfolding. The first body lay on the stage, positioned as if frozen mid-performance. A talented actress, known for her commanding presence and precise timing, was gone. The scene was almost theatrical in its execution, no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, no indication of entry. Yet something subtle drew Benjamin's attention, a faint smudge on the polished floor, slightly displaced stage props, a whisper of displaced velvet on the curtains. Each detail was like a word in a sentence, waiting to be read. He crouched, inspecting the scene. Nothing forced, everything choreographed, he murmured, almost to himself. His mind raced, reconstructing the sequence of events like an intricate play. Whoever did this understood the theater intimately, its hidden corridors, trapdoors, lighting grids, and acoustic quirks. They could move unseen, anticipate reactions, and strike without warning. Benjamin's attention shifted to the cast and crew, gathered nervously along the balconies and backstage corridors. Eyes wide, whispers subdued. Each movement, each glance, each tremor in posture spoke volumes to him. Observation was his weapon, psychology, his guide. The killer's choices would reveal themselves through instinctive reactions, micro-expressions, and the subtle misalignments in their behavior. He rose, walking the length of the stage, imagining the killer's path, from the wings, down a hidden staircase, perhaps even along the catwalk above. The theater was a labyrinth, centuries old, and its secrets were known only to those who had spent lifetimes within its walls. Whoever struck here had mastery of that labyrinth, and Benjamin intended to map it before the phantom struck again. As he studied the stage lights, the balconies, and the heavy velvet curtains, Benjamin felt a chill. The shadows seemed to move with a purpose, as if the theater itself was aware of his presence. Every corner, every hidden doorway, every echoing footstep could be a clue. And in this theater, history itself was a silent witness to the crimes that were unfolding. The first curtain had fallen, but the story was far from over. Somewhere among the echoing corridors, behind the grandeur and gilding of this historic theater, the phantom was watching. And Benjamin Hart, master of observation and understanding human behavior, was ready to uncover the invisible hand that had turned performance into murder. The theater's backstage was a labyrinth of corridors, trapdoors, and hidden passageways, each lined with decades of accumulated dust, paint cans, and forgotten props. Benjamin Hart moved carefully, his eyes scanning the walls, the floor, even the air for subtle anomalies. Every surface, every reflection, every slight disturbance in the shadows could be a clue. The first murder had been executed with a meticulous precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the theater's secrets, secrets that had been hidden for over a century. He began with the cast. Actors were gathered in the rehearsal room, nervously fidgeting with scripts and costumes. Each one moved with subconscious caution, aware of the invisible threat that had already claimed a colleague. Benjamin observed them closely, noting micro-expressions, the tilt of heads, the speed of blinks, and even the way fingers traced the edges of pages. These minute behaviors, often unnoticed by ordinary eyes, were windows into instinct, fear, and hidden knowledge. Benjamin focused on the routines of the staff. Lighting technicians, stagehands, costume designers, all moved in predictable patterns shaped by years of rehearsal. Yet subtle deviations revealed insights. A stagehand who usually left props in precise positions hesitated near a trapdoor, a lighting technician lingered longer than necessary near the catwalk. Benjamin catalogued these deviations, turning each into a mental map of likely knowledge and opportunity. Next, he turned to the architecture itself. The theater, with its ornate balconies and concealed rooms, was more than a venue, it was a complex machine, a network of potential hiding places and shortcuts. Benjamin retraced likely routes the Phantom could have taken, narrow passages above the stage, spiral staircases hidden behind panels, and ancient service corridors sealed from public view. He imagined the killer moving through these spaces, invisible yet precise, leaving no trace but the faintest of disturbances. Then he examined the props and stage equipment. A misplaced candelabra, a scuff on a floorboard, a curtain slightly misaligned, each tiny irregularity told a story. Benjamin reconstructed hypothetical sequences, the killer's timing, the order of movements, and even the pauses that allowed the crime to unfold seamlessly. The Phantom's mastery of the theater was evident, they had used its acoustics, its shadows, and its history as tools in the execution of murder. Benjamin also began to probe psychological patterns. The killer was intelligent, meticulous, and confident, but human. Fear, habit, and instinct left traces, subtle and almost invisible. By subtly rearranging minor routines and observing reactions, Benjamin began to narrow the list of potential suspects. Every startled glance, every hesitation, every instinctive adjustment became part of the puzzle. As the day progressed, Benjamin's observations converged into a growing map of the Phantom's likely behaviors. He saw patterns in timing, routes, and reactions. The murderer was not only skilled in stealth but also in understanding human nature, a strategist who treated the theater like a chessboard, and the people within it as pieces to be manipulated. By nightfall, Benjamin returned to the stage, standing beneath the ornate chandeliers that had illuminated countless premieres. He closed his eyes for a moment, reconstructing the events, imagining the Phantom's movements, and tracing the invisible thread that connected every murder. The shadows of the theater were alive with history, fear, and anticipation, and somewhere within them, the next act of this deadly drama was already being planned. Benjamin Hard, master of observation and human psychology, was ready. The game had begun, and the Phantom of the theater would soon learn that even the most carefully choreographed movements could be traced by the eyes that never blinked. The theater was quiet now, the echo of rehearsal footsteps fading into the ornate balconies above. Benjamin Hard remained backstage, eyes sweeping the dim corridors where shadows clung like velvet drapes. Each actor, each crew member, carried subtle signs of tension, a twitch, a glance, a pause in speech. These were threads, and Benjamin intended to weave them into a map of behavior, intent, and opportunity. He began with the cast. During the day's rehearsal, Benjamin observed routines, entrances and exits, interactions with props, positioning on stage. Actors repeated movements hundreds of times, yet minute deviations betrayed instinctive reactions to unseen pressure. He noted which performers hesitated near trapdoors, who lingered unusually near lighting grids, and whose gaze unconsciously followed unseen corridors. These were not errors but unconscious signals, hints of who understood, or feared, the hidden dangers within the theater. Next, he observed the crew. Stagehands and lighting technicians moved with practiced precision, yet Benjamin noticed inconsistencies. A ladder left slightly askew, a rope tension misaligned, or a prop set just off-center. These small deviations suggested either distraction or knowledge. He cross-referenced these with the timing of the murders, finding subtle correlations between certain individuals' routines and the Phantom's movements. Benjamin also revisited the architectural complexities. Staircases hidden behind decorative panels, narrow passages above the ceiling, and catwalks over the stage offered multiple vantage points. He imagined the Phantom navigating these spaces with confidence, using shadows, acoustics, and angles to avoid detection. His mind traced countless hypothetical routes, narrowing possibilities based on the smallest inconsistencies. He then tested psychological reactions. During a staged rehearsal, Benjamin subtly altered cues, a misplaced prop, a slight change in lighting, a minor deviation in stage direction. Observing micro-expressions and instinctive movements, he noted which individuals noticed anomalies and how they reacted. The phantom, intelligent and methodical, would respond predictably, revealing understanding without consciously realizing it. Patterns began to emerge. The killer was meticulous, patient, and intimately familiar with the theater. They knew which doors were locked, which corridors offered cover, and how to manipulate the stage to their advantage. Every murder followed a precise choreography, exploiting the environment, fear, and human behavior. Benjamin charted these patterns, each murder becoming a note in a complex symphony of crime. By evening, Benjamin had constructed a mental diagram linking actors, crew, timing, and architectural features. The phantom's movements were no longer entirely invisible, they were predictable. Yet, the murderer remained elusive, slipping through the gaps of ordinary observation. Benjamin smiled slightly, this was precisely the challenge he thrived on. As the chandeliers cast long shadows across the stage, Benjamin considered the next steps. Understanding the phantom's patterns was one thing, but forcing them to reveal themselves required patience, strategy, and subtle provocation. The next act would be critical. The theater itself, centuries old and filled with secrets, had become a stage for a psychological duel between detective and murderer. And in the quiet anticipation of the empty theater, Benjamin Hart prepared for the game to intensify. Every movement, every shadow, every instinctive reaction would be scrutinized. The phantom of the theater was no ordinary criminal, but neither was Benjamin, and soon, their invisible duel would edge closer to a decisive confrontation. Benjamin Hart returned to the theater the next morning, the historic building humming with quiet energy. Actors rehearsed lines, technicians adjusted lights, and the faint smell of stage paint lingered in the corridors. Every element, from the polished floors to the faded velvet curtains, was a potential clue, and Benjamin moved with the patience of a predator observing its prey. He had spent the previous days mapping the theater, tracing likely paths, and identifying behavioral patterns. Now it was time to test his deductions. Subtle traps would reveal reactions, and reactions would reveal understanding. Nothing overt, Benjamin didn't need to alarm the phantom yet. He preferred invisible threads of observation, invisible enough that the murderer would unknowingly betray themselves. His first test involved the props. A candelabra was slightly misaligned on stage, a script left marginally out of order on a rehearsal table. Observing from the shadows, Benjamin watched who noticed, who reacted, and how. Micro-expressions flashed across faces, a raised eyebrow, a subtle pause in movement, a finger tracing an edge to reposition it. These were the small signals of attention and awareness he had been waiting for. Next, he manipulated stage lighting. He dimmed and shifted lights during a rehearsal, changing angles and creating faint shadows along the corridors. Some actors moved instinctively to avoid stepping into dark spots, others glanced toward hidden areas, their eyes betraying recognition of something out of place. Each reaction was a piece of the puzzle. Benjamin catalogued every movement, every instinctive glance, turning them into a map of perception and familiarity. He also subtly altered routines. A ladder placed slightly differently, a rope pulled tighter than usual, and minor deviations in stage cues, nothing that would disrupt the rehearsal, but enough to provoke reaction. The phantom, Benjamin suspected, relied on habitual understanding of the theater. By introducing these small anomalies, he could see who adjusted, hesitated, or otherwise displayed knowledge of the hidden intricacies. Throughout the day, Benjamin observed the interplay between actors and crew. He noticed patterns: certain individuals lingered in specific corridors longer than necessary, others reacted immediately to anomalies, and a few seemed entirely unaware. These distinctions helped him narrow his focus. The phantom's familiarity with the theater was undeniable, but every mind, no matter how clever, left traces in the form of reactions. By evening, Benjamin had constructed a subtle web of observation. Each trap had produced micro-responses, each response a clue. The phantom's presence was beginning to reveal itself through instinct rather than action. Benjamin didn't need physical evidence yet, human behavior was the most revealing trace of all. He paused on the stage, looking out at the grand auditorium. Chandeliers glimmered faintly in the dimming light, and the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The next act in this deadly theater had begun, and Benjamin Hard, master of observation and psychological insight, was ready. Every shadow, every gesture, and every instinctive reaction would guide him closer to the invisible murderer. The phantom of the theater had met its first unseen challenge, and for the first time, its veil of invisibility showed the slightest tear. Benjamin smiled, knowing the game had intensified, and that the next move would be crucial in exposing the mind behind the murders. The theater, cloaked in evening shadows, seemed to hold its breath as Benjamin Hard moved through the backstage corridors. After days of observation and subtle tests, he began to see the first tangible threads among the tapestry of behavior and architecture. The phantom's pattern was no longer invisible, it was emerging in the minutiae, in the imperceptible deviations from normal routine. Benjamin revisited the first crime scene, standing on the stage where the actress had fallen victim. He measured distances, traced lines of sight, and reconstructed possible movements. The faint smudge on the floor, initially overlooked, now suggested a deliberate path, a choreography of intent rather than randomness. He noted the position of props, the alignment of curtains, even the orientation of the candelabra. Each element contributed to a narrative that only a trained eye could read. He turned to the cast and crew, watching interactions as rehearsals continued. Small inconsistencies began to stand out, a stagehand adjusting a rope with unusual care, a lighting technician glancing repeatedly toward a hidden staircase, an actor hesitating near a trapdoor that led to the catwalk. These reactions, though subtle, signaled awareness, perhaps knowledge of past movements or familiarity with hidden passages. Benjamin documented every detail meticulously. Next, he examined the theater's hidden architecture. Spiral staircases, narrow service corridors, and ceiling catwalks had all been utilized in ways that suggested premeditation. By cross-referencing observed behavior with the structural layout, Benjamin began plotting likely routes the phantom might have used. He considered timing, lighting, and acoustics, piecing together sequences that explained how the murderer had moved unseen, striking with precision while maintaining absolute control over the environment. Benjamin then focused on psychological patterns. The phantom's intelligence and familiarity with the theater suggested a calculated mind, but even the most disciplined criminal could not entirely suppress instinctive reactions. During a rehearsal, he introduced minor discrepancies, a prop slightly misplaced, a sound subtly out of place. Observing who noticed and how they responded, Benjamin began identifying probable suspects. Each micro-reaction was a breadcrumb leading closer to the murderer's identity. He also discovered patterns in the choice of victims. Each had a high profile within the theater community, recognized for skill, charisma, or influence. The phantom selected targets with precision, choosing moments when the audience's attention or the chaos of rehearsal provided cover. Benjamin analyzed motivations, envy, rivalry, or psychological fixation, using them to refine his profile of the killer. By late evening, Benjamin had gathered enough evidence to narrow his focus. The phantom's movements, behaviors, and psychological markers began to form a coherent map. He could anticipate likely actions, predict the next location, and prepare for confrontation. Yet the murderer remained invisible, an unseen presence threading through shadows and corridors. Standing alone on the stage, under the grand chandeliers, Benjamin allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. For the first time, the invisible threads converged into a visible pattern. The phantom of the theater was not untouchable, it was only a matter of patience, observation, and strategy. And Benjamin Hard, master of the unseen and the subtle, was ready to follow the next thread, wherever it might lead. Benjamin Hard moved silently through the labyrinthine backstage corridors, his mind running like a finely tuned engine. Days of observation, analysis, and subtle provocations had yielded a growing map of the phantom's behaviors. The killer was meticulous, intelligent, and intimately familiar with the theater's hidden spaces, but Benjamin was beginning to see the patterns that would eventually expose them. He revisited the points of interest, the trapdoors under the stage, the spiral staircases hidden behind ornate panels, the narrow catwalks above the stage where shadows could be manipulated. Each location had been part of the Phantom's choreography. By comparing these points with the timing of previous murders and the reactions of cast and crew, Benjamin began reconstructing the invisible routes the killer had used. Observation remained key. He watched the actors rehearse, noting the smallest deviations from routine, a hand lingering on a railing longer than necessary, a footstep slightly off rhythm, a glance that lingered too long toward a hidden passage. These were not conscious actions but instinctive behaviors, betraying knowledge of the spaces most others ignored. Benjamin logged each movement with precision, creating a mental blueprint of familiarity and access. He also studied the staff's routines. Lighting technicians, stagehands, and costume designers moved with practiced fluidity, yet Benjamin noticed subtle anomalies. A ladder shifted slightly, ropes pulled taut at the wrong moment, props replaced with imperceptible alterations. These were not mistakes but potential breadcrumbs. The Phantom relied on predictability, and any deviation, however minor, revealed the human element behind the calculated murders. Benjamin began combining behavioral patterns with architectural knowledge. He could anticipate where the Phantom would likely move during rehearsals or performances, predicting which shadows would be used and which exits would remain unseen. This was a game of strategy, a psychological chess match played across centuries-old floors and hidden corridors. As the day progressed, Benjamin introduced controlled variables to test reactions further. He altered minor cues in rehearsals, created slight inconsistencies in stage placement, and monitored responses. Certain individuals reacted instinctively, revealing awareness of areas supposedly unnoticed. Each reaction tightened the net around the elusive killer. By evening, Benjamin had developed a list of potential suspects, ranked by access, knowledge, and reaction patterns. The Phantom was highly intelligent, but even the cleverest mind left traces in instinct and habit. Benjamin's patience and attention to detail were slowly turning invisible threads into visible leads. Standing beneath the chandeliers on the empty stage, Benjamin allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. The theater was a living organism, its walls echoing with history and whispers of past performances. And somewhere among those echoes, the Phantom was watching, moving with precision, calculating the next act. But Benjamin was ready. He had mapped the patterns, traced the invisible threads, and anticipated the next move. The game was far from over, but the first decisive steps toward capturing the Phantom had been taken. The invisible murderer was no longer untouchable, and Benjamin Hard was closing the distance, one shadow at a time. The theater was alive with anticipation, though it appeared empty to the casual observer. Benjamin Hard moved through the corridors with quiet precision, his mind fully engaged in the subtle game that had consumed the past week. The Phantom, clever and meticulous, had remained invisible, but Benjamin now sensed that the killer was aware someone was watching, aware of the invisible net closing in. He positioned himself near the main stage during rehearsal, eyes scanning every actor, every crew member, and every movement. Small gestures, the flick of a hand, the direction of a glance, all became part of the intricate puzzle. Benjamin had begun manipulating the environment in controlled ways, creating tiny deviations and observing instinctive responses. Each reaction was a message, a psychological signature revealing understanding and intent. The Phantom's intelligence was undeniable. Whoever had committed these murders had studied human behavior as carefully as they had studied the theater itself. They moved with calculated restraint, exploiting the environment, exploiting timing, and exploiting the predictability of those around them. Benjamin recognized the sophistication immediately. This was a criminal playing a mental game as much as a physical one. During a rehearsal scene, Benjamin introduced a subtle anomaly. A prop was slightly misplaced, and the lighting on stage shifted by mere degrees. Almost instantly, one of the actors reacted, instinctively adjusting the position of the prop and glancing toward the hidden catwalk. Benjamin observed silently, recognizing the reaction as the first conscious display of the phantom's indirect influence. The murderer was clever, but even the most careful manipulation could not entirely mask instinct. Benjamin expanded his observations, noting patterns across multiple rehearsals. Certain individuals demonstrated heightened awareness, reacting in ways that indicated intimate knowledge of hidden areas and timing. He began constructing a psychological map, correlating reactions with access, knowledge, and subtle behavioral cues. Each micro-reaction, each hesitation, each instinctive movement brought him closer to identifying the phantom. He also studied the audience's impact. The theater's acoustics, the presence of observers, and the weight of historical reputation all influenced behavior. The phantom accounted for these factors, moving in harmony with the performance, blending murder with stagecraft. Benjamin considered the duality, the crime as performance and the performance as cover, and realized the killer's genius lay in this psychological interplay. By nightfall, Benjamin had identified key suspects, each linked to specific reactions and patterns of awareness. The duel had become explicit, the phantom maneuvered through shadows, and Benjamin maneuvered through observation. Every movement, every response, every instinctive action had become part of the chessboard. Standing alone in the empty theater, Benjamin allowed himself a brief reflection. The phantom had proven to be an adversary of exceptional intellect, but the detective had patience, insight, and observation on his side. The psychological duel had reached a critical point. The next act would demand both cunning and precision. And Benjamin Hard, master of the unseen and the subtle, was ready for the decisive confrontation that loomed in the shadows of the historic theater. The night air outside the theater was cool, but inside, the tension was almost tangible. Benjamin Hard paced quietly through the dim backstage corridors, tracing the web of movements and reactions he had observed over the past week. Every shadow, every creaking floorboard, and every flicker of light was a potential signal. The phantom had been cautious, but Benjamin sensed that the murderer was close, too close to ignore. Tonight's rehearsal was a carefully orchestrated trap, though it appeared ordinary to anyone else. Benjamin had arranged slight deviations in stage cues, props, and lighting, creating a controlled environment to observe instinctive responses. Each adjustment was minor enough to go unnoticed by ordinary eyes but significant enough to provoke subtle reactions from someone intimately familiar with the theater's hidden routes and secret passages. From his vantage point near the catwalk above the stage, Benjamin watched the actors move through their lines. The phantom's presence was not overt, but a flicker in the shadows, a slight hesitation, a shift in posture, betrayed awareness. Benjamin focused, noting every micro-expression and instinctive adjustment. His mind raced, reconstructing possible paths the murderer could take, anticipating reactions before they happened. Then, a movement caught his attention. A figure slipped through a narrow corridor, almost imperceptible, pausing briefly to check surroundings. Benjamin's pulse quickened. The pattern was unmistakable, this was no ordinary crew member or actor. The phantom was making a calculated approach, testing the environment, probing for weaknesses. Benjamin remained silent, observing, knowing that one wrong move could alert the killer. He followed the sequence mentally, tracing the route, a trapdoor under the stage, a spiral staircase hidden behind the main curtain, a catwalk above the auditorium. Each step had been calculated for stealth and efficiency. Benjamin could almost feel the murderer's thought process, predicting movements, anticipating the next pause, the next glance. Every instinctive reaction provided confirmation, tightening the net around the elusive figure. Suddenly, the phantom's attention flicked toward Benjamin's position. A shadow shifted, a breath held. The game had become dangerous. Benjamin's heart remained steady, he had anticipated this possibility. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted his vantage point, staying within shadows, maintaining concealment. The duel of observation and instinct was reaching its peak, each move a test of wit and awareness. For a tense moment, the two minds confronted each other across the empty corridors and vast stage. The phantom's skill and intelligence were undeniable, but Benjamin's patience, insight, and mastery of human behavior matched it step for step. Neither moved too quickly, both analyzed, calculated, and weighted. The theater itself seemed to hold its breath, centuries of history echoing through the shadows. By the end of the night, Benjamin had gathered enough mental evidence to narrow the circle of suspects dramatically. The phantom had been aware, testing and probing, but the detective had remained several steps ahead, observing reactions, tracing invisible threads, and predicting the next move. The confrontation had passed for now, but the climax was approaching, and the phantom of the theater would soon face the inevitable reckoning. The theater was silent now, the echoes of rehearsals fading into history. Benjamin Hard stood near the center of the stage, the grand chandeliers above casting muted light across the polished floors. The long chase, the subtle observations, and the intricate psychological mapping had led to this moment. The phantom of the theater would reveal themselves tonight, whether willingly or by mistake. Benjamin's mind ran through every detail. He had watched patterns, traced reactions, and constructed a precise profile of the murderer. Knowledge of the theater's hidden corridors, trapdoors, and catwalks had allowed him to predict the phantom's likely movements. Yet anticipation was as critical as strategy. One misstep could allow the killer to vanish into shadows, leaving another life in ruin. From the wings, he observed the first signs. A figure moved cautiously, almost gliding across the backstage floor, their attention drawn to a minor deviation in the placement of a prop. Benjamin held his breath, the subtle reaction confirmed his suspicions. This was the phantom, reacting instinctively, unaware that their every movement was being silently monitored. He followed mentally, tracking every step along hidden routes and service corridors. The murderer paused near the spiral staircase behind the main curtain, peered into the empty auditorium, and considered the next move. Benjamin's pulse was steady, his mind calculating the best approach. He needed the confrontation to occur on his terms, within controlled conditions. With careful timing, Benjamin emerged from the shadows. "It ends tonight," he said quietly, his voice calm, commanding attention without alarming the killer. The phantom froze, the figure's instincts warring with surprise. Their eyes flicked to the familiar detective, realization dawning. Benjamin had outmaneuvered them, predicting every instinctive reaction, every step along the hidden pathways. The confrontation was psychological as much as physical. Benjamin advanced slowly, observing micro-expressions, calculating reactions, and maintaining control. "You've mastered the theater's secrets, use them with precision," he said, "but even the cleverest mind leaves traces, in behavior, instinct, and choice." The phantom tried to move, but the net of observation and preparation had been closed. Benjamin anticipated each action, countering with subtle shifts in positioning and tone. Every attempt to evade was met with a calculated response, until finally, the killer's bluff collapsed. Their confidence, built on intellect and control, shattered under the weight of relentless scrutiny and insight. When it was over, Benjamin examined the murderer, understanding not just the method but the motive. Jealousy, ambition, and a twisted fascination with theater had driven the phantom to perfection in crime. Knowledge, skill, and patience had elevated the murderer's deeds, but it was human emotion, unchecked pride and obsession, that had made capture inevitable. Standing under the chandeliers, Benjamin reflected on the resolution. The theater, centuries old, had witnessed another chapter of drama, one of murder, cunning, and ultimate justice. The phantom of the theater would no longer haunt its corridors, yet the lessons lingered: knowledge without humility, genius without conscience, and obsession without restraint were dangerous combinations. Benjamin Hard, ever observant, ever calculating, had closed the case. The final act had been performed, the murderer unmasked, and the theater, for now, reclaimed its shadows for art rather than crime. The morning after the confrontation was quiet, almost surreal. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the historic theater, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Benjamin Hard walked through the empty auditorium, the echo of his footsteps merging with memories of the past week's deadly events. The phantom of the theater had been unmasked, the mystery solved, but the weight of the experience lingered. The cast and crew were gathered in the rehearsal hall, relief and exhaustion written across their faces. Whispers and cautious smiles reflected the release from fear. Benjamin observed them from a distance, noting how life returned gradually to the theater. Performers resumed their routines, technicians checked equipment, and even the most traumatized stagehands began to move with confidence. Yet, Benjamin understood that the scars of fear would remain, subtle, invisible, but real. He retraced the path of the final confrontation, reviewing each detail in his mind. Every corridor, every hidden staircase, every shadow had been part of a complex dance between predator and observer. The phantom had been clever, patient, and meticulously prepared, but human instincts, micro-reactions, hesitation, pride, had provided the final key. Benjamin's mastery of observation and psychology had turned those subtle signs into decisive evidence. The theater itself seemed to exhale, reclaiming its centuries-old identity. The grand chandeliers, gilded balconies, and polished floors once again became mere witnesses to art, rather than crime. Benjamin took a moment on the stage, imagining the performances of the past, the lives affected by the murders, and the legacy of the building itself. History had once again shaped events, but justice had prevailed. He collected the final pieces of evidence, documenting movements, reactions, and behavioral patterns. Each detail would remain part of the case file, a testament to the phantom's skill and Benjamin's diligence. Yet he did not linger on triumph. The detective's mind already sought the next puzzle, the next pattern, the next shadow that would require understanding and observation. Before leaving, Benjamin paused at the edge of the stage, looking into the empty auditorium. The silence was profound, yet alive with memory. He reflected on the human psyche, the delicate interplay of ambition, jealousy, and brilliance, and how these forces had driven the phantom to commit acts of murder within such a sacred space. The theater, a vessel of dreams, had been tested, and endured. As he stepped into the sunlight of the city streets, Benjamin Hard allowed himself a rare smile. The case was closed, the phantom apprehended, and the theater safe once more. Yet the lessons remained vivid: perception, patience, and the subtle understanding of human behavior could uncover truths that even the cleverest criminal could not conceal. The curtains had fallen on the phantom of the theater, the final act complete. And as Benjamin disappeared into the bustling streets of New York, the city itself seemed to whisper of mysteries yet unsolved, waiting for the mind capable of reading the invisible threads that connected shadows, people, and deeds.